Good afternoon, everyone. This is Tim Gleisner, Head of Collections at the Library of Michigan. Today, joining us is Gerald Van Dusen, the writer of Detroit's Burwood Wall from History Press. As always, if you are interested in this program and want to support this program in any way, please find the contact information for the Library of Michigan Foundation at the beginning and ending credits of today's segment. And with that, I would like to welcome Gerald Van Dusen. Jerry, how are you today?
Afternoon, Tim. I'm feeling fantastic.
And if I may say to everyone, if you want a good history on 20th century Detroit and even preceding that, specifically on racial relations in that city, this is a fantastic book, and really one of the reasons why it was recommended by committee members to be a Michigan Notable Book of this year. And starting out, Jerry, as I ask everyone, if you could just give us some background on yourself and how did you become a writer?
Well, I was born, raised, educated, and employed within the city of Detroit for most of my life. I spent a little bit of time away teaching and working elsewhere, but Detroit is really has pretty much defined my writing, defined my interests. It was really in graduate school that I kind of turned the corner and became a professional writer. I'd been doing the usual English major scrawl, writing essays and the like, but I had a professor who thought that the particular topic I chose might be something publishable. And he showed me how to write for publication as opposed to write for dusty library shelves. And so at that point, I think I began my career as a professional writer. I published my dissertation as an English major, a biography. And then for most of my career, my writing pretty much focused on educational issues, particularly distance learning. I wrote a book called Virtual Campus and another one called Digital Dilemma, dealing with issues of access for city students, particularly focusing on what I knew, that is, as a distance learning instructor for a few of my classes, I had to deal with students whose technology really was not up to, was not adequate. And I learned that how big an issue to educate those that most need it in many instances. We really need to bring our technology, drag it along into the 21st century. But toward the end of my career, I started to get interested in more personal subject matters. I've always had in the back of my head some Detroit topics. And I started to make the transition out of the distance learning classroom and started writing about subjects which more touched me personally.
Okay, so Jerry, why do you feel the reason to write? What is it that you want to convey to people when you're doing your writing?
Well, pretty simple, really. I write to learn. When I began teaching, someone reminded me that when you want to demonstrate, when you want to prove to yourself that you understand a subject, just try teaching it. Just try teaching it. And I think that's really true. Well, what I've learned as a writer is that if I really want to understand a subject, I really have to write about it. I can read all kinds of things. I can listen to interviews and news programs, but you don't necessarily absorb it and understand it. You just find somewhere in your cognitive tree, you hang it somewhere. But to really understand it on a more profound level, I think once you try to articulate, whether it's through teaching or in my case, whether it's through or if it's writing, you start to grasp it on a more profound level. So, as I say, to put it simply, I write to better understand the topics I am most interested in.
So can I ask, and this is a question again I ask a lot of people, how often do you find yourself writing? Is there a limit that you do every day? Is it just based on the amount of research you get and then you say, that's it. Now I'm going to start writing.
I suppose I'm probably a little unusual in that, I mean, from reading biographies and listening to professional writers who write every day, maybe 500 words, 1,000 words, not so in my case. I will read something, I will write something, and I have to walk away from it for a period of time. And I have to think about it. And it might be several days before I get back to it, not because I had anything special to do, but because I don't have anything more to say about it. It just, something will hit me, some idea, some variation of what I wrote will strike me, and I'll come back to it and rewrite what I wrote. And it's so, it's just the way my brain works. I just have to let my instincts tell me when it's time to sit down and add to the existing paragraph or pages that have begun.
So can I ask, like, which writers do you find yourself reading, and which writers do you feel like you would like to, I don't want to say imitate, but really, you know, pattern yourself after?
Well, as an English major, I pretty much, you know, read all of the classic novels, you know, the 20th century, the Hemingway and Fitzgeralds, and in the 19th century, you know, the Hawthorne and Melvilles. But I think once I started writing professionally, I started reading more nonfiction. And nowadays, what with my interest in civil rights, I find that I'm reading lawyers, and in some instances, I'm reading high school teachers who are writers. I mean, just a broad array of writers. I just finished reading Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, about how the U.S. became complicit in the segregation of African Americans across the country, particularly in the North. And then I read Tobin Buck's book about crime during the Civil War, because I wanted to understand how and when police departments were formed in the big cities, how Detroit organized its police department, and as it so happens, Detroit's first race riot, which occurred during the Civil War in 1863. So it helped me understand more or less the evolution of the concept of law and order. And as I say, civil rights, early civil rights, very early civil rights, the history of Jim Crow and the Black Codes after the Civil War. So I guess I'm just filling in a lot of gaps because I was not raised or trained as an historian. I was raised as an English major, and so I'm playing a lot of catch up right now, reading a lot of history and trying to fill in these very broad areas of my ignorance.
So reading your book, I know how you got the idea for the book, and you already alluded to it a little bit early on. How did you get the idea for this specific subject? What really prompted you that, you know, this would be the topic?
Well, it's been in my head for 50 years, ever since the, I tell an anecdote in the preface about how when I was 16 years old, I met a friend of mine from my math class. He was having some problems with his Latin, and I was a little better with Latin and English than he was with math. So we agreed to meet, and at his house near my school. I was attending a private Catholic school at 7 Mile and Cherry Lawn, which in fact was about a mile from the wall. And I didn't know about the wall at the time. But I was over at his house, which was a little west of the wall, and we were going through geometry problems, and that I was having a problem with, and he was helping me with those, and I was helping him with translating some Latin. When we were done, my dad was going to pick me up, I guess about an hour later, so we had a little time to kill when we walked the neighborhood, and we came across the wall. The Burwood wall between Mendota and Burwood, and he challenged me to climb the top and to walk its length. which extends from 8 Mile Road south 3 blocks with breaks at 2 side streets. So I climbed the wall. He was behind me. I got about a half a block, I guess, and I tripped over a tree branch because the wall was constructed in 41 and this was 1962.
Sure.
So I tripped and fell onto the grass. And I said, this is really stupid. Why would anybody go to the time, labor, and expense of putting a 6-foot thick wall up when you could have put up a chain link fence and done the same thing?
Sure.
And he looked down at me and said simply, it was to keep people like you away from people like me.
Huh.
And I was 16 years old, obviously naive. My friend apparently was a good deal more experienced with discrimination. And I don't remember much about that day, but I've remembered that conversation and it stayed with me. And I guess the reason I decided to write about it was because when the internet became the thing and articles started, Detroit Free Press and News went online, I would search for Burwood Wall or Mendota Wall. And now and then I'd find something, but it was really about the construction of the wall, nothing about the community that was walled in. And to me, that was the most interesting aspect, was the community itself, that what impact did it have on their lives? Why was it constructed, and how did they address the issue of being walled in? So I searched for anything that had been written to answer that question, could find nothing, and decided when I approached the publisher that my plan was to treat the wall as a symbol of all the various kinds of barriers that African Americans confronted, and focusing upon this community just to the east of the wall. I wanted to find out who these people are, who these people were, and what kind of a life they lived, how they dealt with the ignominy of being walled in, as it were. And I wish that I had begun earlier, because many of the people that I talked to named people that had passed away that would have been terrific interviewees. So I had to go into nursing homes, senior centers, practice a little research serendipity, and walk the neighborhoods, see if I could bump into people that remember the time when the wall was put up, or remember stories about the wall, or had relatives, or have relatives that maybe are living elsewhere and would be willing to talk to me. So it was a pretty unconventional approach, and I really had no historical training. So it seemed appropriate that I did it the way I did, because I don't think any training would have really helped me a whole lot, since there were no secondary sources. It was built on the back of storytelling. And I whatever sources that were secondary I used were peripheral. I mean, lots and lots of stories and publications about Black Bottom downtown and Paradise Valley, but virtually nothing about this square mile enclave up on West 8 Mile. So I had to reconstruct, I had to redraw the map of Detroit, as it were, and learn about the half a dozen African-American enclaves in Detroit, and how it came about that these African-Americans gravitated toward these 6 areas, one of which was the subject of the book. The others will be the subject of future work.
Can you tell us about that area? That's primarily Royal Oak Township, is that correct? Am I understanding that?
It's half
Okay.
township. The other half is the half-mile square in Detroit. So you have to think of the area east of the wall as being a 1 square mile area. From the wall itself, Burwood, going about 12 blocks east, and then about 6 blocks south of 8 Mile, and about 6 blocks north of 8 Mile. You have to kind of forget about county lines, because 8 Mile divides Oakland County from Wayne County. But prior to that section of Detroit being incorporated into Detroit in 1923, I believe, it was just farmland, part of what was called Greenfield Township, adjacent to Royal Oak Township, which itself was 36 square miles. So over time, Royal Oak Township shrunk. Cities incorporated, Madison Heights and Oak Park and so on and so forth, until all that was left was this very small hamlet, which is today's Royal Oak Township, which is, I'm guessing, 95% African American. Mm-hmm. It was attached culturally, economically, and perhaps other ways to the half square mile south of 8 Mile, which was one of the last areas incorporated in Detroit. So that square mile was which is what I'm referring to as West 8 Mile. Half in Oakland County, half in Detroit, and the wall was put up symbolically to say that you're on one side, we are on the other side, and never the twain shall meet. In fact, that's almost exactly what the builder told a committee that approached him and said, is it really necessary to put this wall up? And the builder said, east is east, west is west, never the twain shall meet. And he thought that would adequately explain how blacks and whites needed to remain segregated de facto, if not de jure.
Can I ask if you could just explain a little more as to what the builder's thoughts, obviously to keep blacks and whites separate, but why? What was the reasoning back then in 1941, I believe, right?
Yeah, it's. I'll try to be brief, but it is a complicated story. There's really two major factors. The first one is what you call covenants, real estate covenants. In the big cities of the North, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Chicago, race-related, race-restrictive covenants were put into the property deeds to facilitate the sale of property, to make whites feel more secure that neighbors were not going to sell to blacks. And approximately 80% of Detroit still is, the deeds contain these covenants. And it wasn't until 1948 when the Supreme Court ruled that the covenants were unenforceable that blacks could technically jump the wall or could move elsewhere. But that was made made difficult by real estate interests, neighborhood associations and the like. So, in simple economics, houses were more expensive in the white areas. So the race-restricted covenants go all the way back to about 1900, and it really began in California and in Massachusetts. But when the Great Migration occurred, real estate developers, as they attempted to build to keep up with demands for housing, they decided to incorporate these racially restrictive covenants into their property deeds. So that left very little property in Detroit: Black Bottom, Paradise Valley, a section of West Side, off of Grand River. There's a little north, just adjacent to Hamtramck, there's a small section called North End. Conant Gardens to the north, the middle class section, just east of Woodward. And then West 8 Mile Road. These are all areas that had not been racially restricted, so blacks gravitated to the areas where they were allowed to rent or build, not necessarily build with any federal financing. And that was the second major, I guess I would call it a provocation, because at this time, you've got to remember, there's a race conflict coming, 1943, there's going to be a major race riot in Detroit. There was a series of provocations, one of which was overcrowding as a consequence of these racially restrictive covenants, where blacks were being forced or pushed into these very limited areas. And during the war, I mean, the population of African Americans in Detroit doubled from 150,000 to 300,000 almost overnight. Where do you put these people when you have 6 small enclaves, when 2 of them are really middle-class enclaves? Conant Gardens, for instance, were some Ford executives, postmen, teachers, lawyers, dentists. And so if you were coming from the north, I'm sorry, if you were coming from the south, you didn't move into Conant Gardens unless you had money. The same with the west side. That was, it seemed like there was one working class, middle class area on the east side, Conant Gardens, and one on the west side, the old west side, as they refer to it. So you either settled in Black Bottom, you settled in Paradise Valley, perhaps you moved up the road to North End, or you might have heard a story that there was a lot of vacant farmland up around 8 Mile, particularly early during the Great Migration before Detroit had annexed that portion of Detroit and completed its annexation, which was, I believe, in 1926. So there was no Detroit school system operating there. There was no water. So people up there in West 8 Mile were anxious for incorporation. They weren't anxious, however, for the federal government to tell them that if they want to build a house, they're going to have to build it, find a way to build it themselves privately, because they had pretty much, although the word wasn't used, they'd been redlined. Homeowners Loan Corporation during the Depression had created what was referred to as the city survey plan, where appraisers went around and determined the real estate values of sections of real estate. And they color-coded the maps of the cities. And Detroit was color-coded green, blue, yellow, and red. The most desirable sections were green, the least desirable were red, whence redlining in the term in the 1960s. And the area of 8 Mile, because the houses were built by hand, they were not receiving any mortgage insurance from the FHA. And this went hand in hand. The FHA was not giving mortgage insurance because they were building them piecemeal, and they were being built piecemeal because the FHA was not giving the money. I mean, is it the chicken or is it the egg here? But so the area was deemed hazardous. That was the actual word when the map colors were delineated, hazardous area. So when in 1941, when this developer wanted to develop the area west, now this is just before the war, so there's still very much interest in private development. Once the war kicks in, of course, it's going to be very difficult to do any building because lumber and other supplies are going to go to England.
Sure.
They're going to go to the war effort. And so in 1941, this developer, probably Harry Slatkin, by the way, approached the FHA after he had been rejected for FHA insurance. And he comes up with this novel idea. Well, what if we physically separate the areas? What if I put up a significant barrier between the two, a 6-foot wall, and I extend it all the way from where I would begin the development at 8 Mile to as far down as my other developments. This was a Jewish developer who had quite a number of developments in Detroit as the Jewish population had moved generationally northwest through Detroit.
Sure.
From the 19th century in Black Bottom through the 1967 Riot area and on northwest into this area. There were a lot of Jewish delicatessens when I went to school at U of D Jesuit along the walkway of 7 Mile from Wyoming to campus. I get off the bus early so I could walk past the Jewish delicatessens and take in the aroma of the bagels and other baked goods, so I just run in to get a donut. And then the next generation moves into Oak Park, West Bloomfield, and the like. But the generational movement was northwest, and so Harry Slatkin or some other developer wanted to safeguard his investment and convince the FHA that despite the proximity of this hazardous area, a wall would indicate clear separation and protection. symbolically, if not physically. So, and then of course there's a third issue, and this is what I'm working on now, and it's a difficult subject, and that is policing. Mm. There is a concept referred to as control and containment. Now this pushes the ball, rolling it down a little further, but you remember that after the 1967 riots, which is just another link in a long chain of abuses, that there was an important mayoral election in Detroit in 1969 between Sheriff Roman Gribbs and the Richard Austin, the Wayne County auditor. And it was the closest election probably in Detroit history, 50% to 49 point something percent. And Sheriff Roman Gribbs was the law and order candidate and used the term, and you'd think, well, that came right out of Richard Nixon's playbook, but it really didn't. It came out of Lyndon Johnson's playbook. Right after the 1967 riots, and I mean immediately after, within a couple of weeks. You know, you've got the Newark riot, you've got the 67 Detroit riot. Johnson organized a commission to investigate the causes of these riots, the Watts riot of 65 and so on. And the commission took no time at all to make clear that the answer lied in large part with what they simply called white racism. And they studied these issues that I've just spoken about. Well, Johnson had the idea that there were other players involved, and he more or less closed the book on the report, which suggested sort of a pandemic response, sort of a $1 trillion investment in job training and education and in housing. They thought that it was the only way you were going to truly indicate a commitment and possibly turn the chapter. Otherwise, they predicted that well-known phrase that we were moving toward two societies, and one white, and one white, and it's exactly what's happened. You could see it coming from the 43 riot. You saw it in 67. You see it today. And it's a continuation, another link. We're just attaching another link to the chain. And so the more I write, the more I learn, and the more links I'm attaching. And so I'm kind of now, I just completed, I'm sorry if I'm going far afield here.
No, it's good.
In 1943, there was the race riot. It was truly a race riot, black, white. My father was an attorney at the time. In 1941, and he told stories about growing up, having his practice downtown, and he'd look out a window and he'd see a group of whites chasing some blacks. He'd look out another window and he'd see some blacks chasing whites. He said it was truly a race riot. 67, I knew intimately because I worked in the inner city. I worked as a commercial teller for the National Bank of Detroit at Warren and 31st, and during the second and third day of the riot, it came toward us, came down Warren Avenue, and you could hear the popping, buildings blowing up from the gas explosions. Molotov was thrown in and gas would, leak would set it off. I never had any problem with any of the neighbors. I felt very comfortable. African-American neighbors, Middle Eastern neighbors would come into the bank. I'd walk the neighborhood, get my lunch. It was, to me, it was never a black-white issue. I mean, there were elements of that. It was really African-American and police. It was a response to this control and containment. Police were authorized to control crime by containing it to certain districts. And these districts were, despite the Supreme Court decision in 1948 to invalidate the racially restrictive covenants, to try to keep it in certain areas. And so I think that really that's the helps me better understand why there was this rioting and why in the early 70s when Roman Gribbs came in, why instead of looking at the prescriptions of the commission, he decided to go Machiavellian and attempt to resolve crime by attempting a few extreme measures, one of which was the stress unit, STRESS, Stop the Robberies, Enjoy Safe Streets. It was a decoy problem, a decoy program where approximately 100 undercover police would infiltrate the most dangerous, that is, African-American sections of Detroit, and would pretend to be looking for prostitutes, looking for late night alcohol purchases or numbers, whatever, and would pretty much set themselves up as decoys. And they'd be approached by young thugs, or what was, there were certain terms used at the time. Thug was not the term, but anyway. And a few of the stress officers got carried overboard, and I think one, Mr. Stress, by the way, he was nicknamed, he shot and killed 8 or 9 young blacks who were fleeing, who attempted to rob him, and then understood what was happening and took off. Back then, you were allowed to shoot a perpetrator fleeing. And so he would tee off on him, and he alone, as I say, killed a number of young blacks. And there were, I think, about 22 or 23 alleged perpetrators killed during the course of the decoy operation, and all but one were young African Americans. And in one celebrated evening of chaos, Mr. Stress killed 2 teenagers, a 14-year-old and a 15-year-old, who were fleeing from it. They just took off when they realized, and he just took out his gun and shot them both. And that was 1970 to 1974. And this is 2020, and how are things any different? We haven't tried the commission suggestions. We've tried, we've militarized the police. We've done all kinds of crazy police solutions, and maybe it's time to try something else. But so anyway, I'm trying to connect, at least in terms of Detroit history, what the links are in the chain, because it's quite clear that there's a connection going back to the Great Migration and the covenants and the ways in which blacks were isolated.
Can I ask you a question? In this writing of this book, what was the hardest part of the whole experience of writing this book?
Hearing the stories that were, I was simply incredulous at some of the stories that a few of the people were sharing with me. Gloria Butler, for instance, a 90-year-old lady, was telling me about growing up in Detroit and attempting in her Ferndale, she was sent to Ferndale High School, and students were sent on trips into downtown Detroit. They'd go to a movie theater, and she'd be stopped by the usher and told that she could not enter, or if he'd relent, she'd have to go up on the balcony, and the rest of the class would be on the main floor. And you know, she wasn't used to that. She didn't know about that, other than the fact that at Ferndale she was not allowed to swim in the pool, which was reserved for whites. And then after the movies, they'd go to a restaurant on Washington Boulevard, and she'd be denied access at the door. She wouldn't even be allowed to sit anywhere. She'd be told you'd have to wait outside until she told her friends would argue with the management, and to no avail. And she said, no, don't worry about it. So she went up to Woodward and caught a bus home. And these kind of depressing and demoralizing stories, it just kind of weighed heavy, but I didn't experience it. I listened to it, and after several dozen of these anecdotes, you realize how truly naive and inexperienced you are with respect to actual racial problems. You can read about them, but when you hear the story face to face, and it touches you in a way that a textbook description just does not. And I always kind of just had to clear my head afterwards, just kind of go for a ride, or I didn't want to share the stories. I didn't want to tell my wife or my kids about it. It was just numbing. But so I would just try my best to craft them into anecdotes that worked their way in to the book. But I could only include maybe 10%. But the stories repeated themselves anyway. If you followed one story, there's variations after variations of the same story over and over. The kind of harassment that young black males experienced if they broke their parents' curfew. Parents set a curfew because they wanted to protect their kids. They knew if the kids were out after dark, it's not that they would be up to no good, but that the four were out, the so-called four. That meant there were patrol cars of four rather large, burly police who would not hesitate to jump out and give these young males, read them the Riot Act. So parents were very protective of their kids, especially young boys, and try to keep them on the path, at least in my experience talking to the fathers and the sons up on 8 Mile.
Can I ask, where do you position the Burwood Wall in Detroit's history?
Well, it's more important and less important than you think. In terms of less important, it is, after all, just so much concrete. It's in some respect, it's kind of an anachronism. It's just a barrier now. In most cases, if you walk along Burwood, around the other side on Mendota, you don't even see it because of the trees and the outbuildings and the vegetation, shrubs, et cetera. There's only one area along Burwood for about 100 yards that you can see it, where it opens up into a park area. Murals painted on it. So in one respect, it's just like a fence. But in another way, extremely important, if only because it was, as I mentioned earlier, a provocation. After the Burwood Wall, there was the Sojourner Truth housing riot about 2 miles away from the Burwood Wall, where the federal government had allocated property and construction funds to house a couple of hundred African-American war material workers. And the local whites, particularly the local Polish community, was up in arms, very concerned that their daughters would possibly be raped. And that was appearing in documents. The pastor of the local church actually wrote to the United States Housing Authority and said, "We have serious concerns. We have to protect our daughters from potential rape." That was in his letter. It's hard to believe that that would actually be in a letter from the pastor to the housing association, but in fact, I'm quoting almost verbatim. And so there was a riot in February of 1942, just months after FDR declared war. And that's another provocation. Just a couple weeks before the riot itself downtown, there was a strike, a Packard strike, where 25,000 white Packard war material employees, because Packard was not producing Jeeps and the like, other war material. They walked off because 3 African Americans had been assigned to the factory floor. They were receiving, Packard was receiving pressure to integrate the plants. And blacks indeed were working at Packard, but in these very mundane jobs as janitors and the like. And so they agreed to move three male black workers to the production floor. And 25,000 workers walked off and refused to return to work until the blacks were removed. So thank God you had organizations like the UAW, which very strongly in favor of supporting civil rights and integration, and told their workers, look, if you get fired at your own business and we can restock the floor, but understand that you're having a significant effect on producing war material. And this has an impact on the war. And so the UAW stood up to him. Packard did not. Packard did not so much, but the UAW did. And so pressure from the federal government and from the UAW brought the workers back, and the black workers were indeed integrated. These three workers were integrated into the factory floor. But and then 2 weeks later, the riot occurred. So I don't mean to suggest that the Burwood Wall and the Sojourner Truth and the Packard hate strike directly and solely triggered the 43 riot, but they were symbolic of the kinds of daily pressures African Americans were experiencing, and Southern whites were experiencing because they weren't used to being treated on the buses and on the streets on an equal footing in any way, shape, or form. So it was very, very tense experiences. And I rely on my dad's recollections for 43 and my own experiences for 67 to better understand what's happening now in 2020. It's all part of a pattern. And it's just, as I said earlier, not to belabor a metaphor, but a few more links on the chain.
Can I ask, following up on that, how do you feel this work informed your view of Detroit history? You talk about links in the chain, another chapter. Is that how you're feeling about this when it comes to Detroit history, that it's just been an ongoing chapter of racial intolerance, racial strife? Is that how it's informed?
Maybe if I lived in another big city, I would feel differently. But the fact that Detroit is the most, or the second most, and we're talking the Metroplex here, Detroit Metroplex, not just Detroit, but the inner ring suburbs and the like. Detroit Metroplex is the segregated region in the United States. Maybe it's the Milwaukee Metroplex, but Detroit will give Milwaukee a close run for its money in terms of segregation. So Detroit is really a laboratory of de facto segregation. If you can solve the problem of de facto segregation here, there's no reason to believe you can't solve it elsewhere. And I really think that any solution ought to take advantage of the laboratory that we have here in Detroit. Many Detroiters can simply not vacate the premises, cannot integrate into the suburbs. Generational wealth is not a concept that you can that they can grasp, because the land that they may have purchased did not generate the kind of wealth that those of us who live in the suburbs were able to use to fund our kids' college educations, or to buy a nicer, bigger house even further out, deeper into the suburbs. In Detroit, the real estate values plummeted and only recently have begun to climb. And now, of course, with the pandemic, who knows what will happen to real estate values in Detroit. But where real estate values have improved, there are areas that, Corktown and fairly affluent areas. But for most Detroiters, in many respects, things have not changed. And I was talking recently to a Detroit councilman, and I won't use his name since I did not have his permission to repeat too much of what he said, but we were actually walking around, we're walking down Cherry Lawn, which is one of the neighborhoods in the Burwood area. And he was saying that he was recently walking in another district area near Livernois, at 10th precinct, and he said he just didn't see much different there than when he was growing up in the 60s. The same sense of nihilism, desperation, poverty, disenfranchisement were all there. And, you know, this has already been a pretty hot summer. And he said, you know, I'm just really afraid that it wouldn't take a whole lot to set it off again. And I concur. And I'm surprised with these other incidents that we've been lucky so far that nothing has happened here. But I think we've got to massively reinvest in our cities. I think we have to go back to the commission report from 1968, resurrect it, and renew its prescriptions, rethink its prescriptions, perhaps modernize its prescriptions, and instead of pouring more funding into more sophisticated forms of policing, we ought to attack the cause, not the effects.
Can I ask you, so your book was selected as a Michigan Notable Book. What did it mean to you to be selected as a Michigan Notable Book author?
I would say that I think the subject matter, to me, it immediately validated the subject matter. I felt that the subject matter, not so sure about the writing, I don't know about how well the book is written, but I just felt the subject matter really warranted a wider reading than a story on the internet about the federal complicity in constructing the wall. I just think the story of the people and how the wall was symbolic of many different barriers they faced, I just think it touched a nerve, certainly in the area. I know I got an awful lot of feedback from local residents, and I've gotten a lot of emails as well and a lot of interview requests. And I just think it touched a nerve. And I think the award signaled to me that maybe the subject matter also touched a nerve because it wasn't another story about Paradise Valley or other areas of Detroit where stories have been told. It was kind of a new take on Detroit. And I think, I mean, I can't tell you how personally pleased I am that I won the award. I mean, that overwhelmed me that the book was selected. But I just think that it was the right time for the book. And it found its audience fairly quickly. And I'm just absolutely delighted and thankful that it was acknowledged and recognized by the Library of Michigan. And I'm very grateful.
To finish off, why do you think someone should read this book? Why do you think someone should sit down and take the time to look at Detroit's Burwood Wall?
Well, I think if you remember the old Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, he used to say, all politics is local. Well, I've come to believe that all history is local. If you really want to understand movements in time and place, you have to understand them where they took place in space and in time. And I think if you want to understand what's going on across the country in other big cities, a story like Detroit's Burwood Wall should resonate and reverberate. It's metaphoric of what is almost redundant of what is going on elsewhere. And I think reading this will help you understand the broader issues. If you, as I said before, if you understand Detroit and its unique set of problems, you find out the problems are not so unique. And you'll be more in touch with national issues. Local history in this case is really national history.
Well, thank you, Jerry. And everyone, just to tell you, we've been discussing from History Press, the Detroit Burwood Wall. This is the 2020 Michigan Notable Book Author Talk Series. that we've been doing here at the Library of Michigan. My name is Tim Gleisner. We were here today with Gerald Van Dusen, the author of this work, the Detroit Burwood Wall. And just to tell you that if you want to support the Michigan Notable Books program, please contact the Library of Michigan Foundation, and its contact information can be found in the opening and ending credits of today's interview. So, Jerry, thank you so much. And do you have any parting words for us today?
No, but I want to thank you very much for this opportunity. I really enjoyed an opportunity to talk this out. It's always helpful.
Well, thank you. And thank you very much for your timely work. And with that, folks, thank you. And we'll see you next time on the 2020 Michigan Notable Books Author Series Tour. Thank you so much.